The appeasement of Nazi Germany is probably the most infamous diplomatic failure of all time. But what actually happened, and what was appeasement? For this video, I'm going to give a full history of the lead up to World War II, as it pertains to appeasement. This video will not cover some of the more in-depth motivating factors for each side's decision-making process, or my own personal verdict on the policy of appeasement. I have another video on my channel that will cover those. Instead, this is to give the viewer a comprehensive guide to appeasement. For appeasement, it's best to start with the end of World War I and the Treaty of Versailles. The treaty to end the First World War had some pretty harsh terms, and many believe that it helped sow the seeds of the Second World War. Here are some of the key provisions. The German military was only allowed a maximum size of 100,000 personnel. They were not allowed an air force or submarines, and no tanks. Germany also surrendered good portions of territory, which helped to create new states like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Austria. Also, the League of Nations was created as a way of avoiding war at the negotiating table and utilizing the idea of collective security to protect smaller nations from larger ones. And finally, Germany had to pay war reparations to the victorious powers. What this treaty did was, for starters, put a large number of German minorities under the rule of non-Germans, which would one day lead to the temptation to reunite the German people. As well, it led to the feeling of overkill at the peace table. Public opinion in countries like Britain and France started to feel almost immediately after the peace was signed that the terms were overly harsh. While on the German side, resentment at the victorious powers helped fuel the myth that Germany was not defeated on the battlefield, but were betrayed by their leaders. As part of German reparations, France occupied the Rhineland, and the Saarland would be under League of Nations mandate. These are two of the key industrial centers of Germany. And when Germany struggled to keep up with reparations payments, France then occupied the Ruhr region in 1923. This move by France was harshly received in both Germany and Britain. For Britain, it continued to prove that France was being overly harsh with Germany. And for Germany, it was another embarrassment stacked on the already awful feeling after Versailles, pretty much leading to a feeling of us against Europe, or us against the world. This led directly to the Pact of Locarno. In 1925, Britain, Germany, France, Belgium, and Italy got together to ease some of the issues and tensions caused by Versailles. The key points that came out of this were: 1. The German, Belgian, and Franco-German frontiers were fixed, as established by the Treaty of Versailles. 2. That Germany, Belgium, and France would never attack each other except for in legitimate defense, or in consequence of a League of Nations obligation. 3. That they would settle their disputes by peaceful means. In the case of an alleged breach of these undertakings, the signatories would come to the defense of the violated party. 4, and most important of the pact, was the evacuation of French troops from the Ruhr and Allied troops leaving the Rhineland in 1930, 5 years ahead of schedule. The meaning of Locarno was that Germany renounced the use of force to change its western borders, but agreed only to arbitration as regards to its eastern frontiers, and that Great Britain promised to defend Belgium and France, but not Poland or Czechoslovakia. At around the same time that France occupied the Ruhr, Hitler led his armed coup attempt. It failed and he was thrown in prison, originally planned for 5 years, but he got out in 8 months. During his time in prison, his ideas solidified into Mein Kampf, or My Struggle. Some of the key provisions as it pertains to appeasement, and not the whole racial, Aryan superiority thing, was Hitler's plans for Lebensraum, or living space. In the chapter Eastern Policy, Hitler argued that Germans needed this Lebensraum in the East, a historic destiny that would properly nurture the German people, basically using the eastern lands inhabited by the Slavs to help Germany grow strong. The other key point in Hitler's ideology was the belief in armed struggle. He believed strongly that a race needed to fight in order to stay strong, and if a race or nation went too long without fighting, it would become weak. It's essentially a version of social Darwinism, survival of the fittest. However, Hitler's ravings were not widely translated. Some Westerners were able to find translated sections, or even rarer instances, full translations, but for the most part, Western access was restricted from this text. And as Hitler continued to rise in the international stage, many Westerners just dismissed it as the rantings of an angry young man. In fact, Hitler began to distance himself from the book. After becoming Chancellor of Germany in 1933, he dismissed it as fantasies behind bars. What Hitler's imprisonment most importantly did was force him to change tactics. From here on, he was going to use more legitimate politics to rise up, rather than armed revolution. So now, let's go to the rise of the Nazi Party within Germany. Fuck, the YouTube censors are going to come after me for this. So after prison, Hitler became devoted to turning the Nazi Party into a respectable political force, and international crisis helped that party's rise. The biggest boost came in 1929 with the start of the Great Depression, which saw Germany reach over 6 million unemployed by 1932. As economic turmoil increased, Nazi Party membership increased, and by mid-1932 the Nazi Party became the largest party in the Reichstag, or German parliament. They received over 13 million votes and had 37% share of the seats in the Reichstag. This popularity led President Hindenburg to offer the chancellorship, or head of the government, to Hitler. He accepted and started in January of 1933. What came next was one of the biggest economic, political, and military revolutions ever carried out in such a short period of time. On the economic side, he invested heavily in public works, like creating the Autobahn. He also invested in rearmament programs by pouring money into private companies to test military planes and tank production. These helped to soak up Germany's unemployed. On the political side, Hitler capitalized on the death of Hindenburg and a fire in the Reichstag, which he claimed on communist terrorists, to take full control of the government. After that fire, Hitler was given emergency powers to ban all opposition political parties.
Give immediately emergency powers to the Supreme Chancellor.
And combined the office of presidency with his own as chancellor, under the title Führer. This gave him complete control of the government.
So this is how liberty dies, with thunderous applause.
Next, he took complete control of the military, which he did after the Minister of War married a woman who was found out to have previously been a prostitute, and the second in line was accused of homosexual behavior, which gave Hitler the excuse to get rid of both of them and replace them with a new position, in charge of strategically planning for the military. Effectively, full control of the military. And you guessed it, he named himself to that position. Hitler was ruthlessly effective in consolidating his stranglehold on Germany and its future direction. One particular instance was in 1934, called the Night of the Long Knives, when potential rivals to Hitler within the Nazi Party were killed by the SS and Gestapo. With complete control of German society, economy, and military, now is time for Hitler to start realizing his international, territorial goals. So Hitler wants to expand, to act out the goals laid out in Mein Kampf. But the Treaty of Versailles created an international body designed to prevent one power from trying to pursue aggressive foreign policies. That was the League of Nations. The goal of the League was that any disputes could be brought before an international council to be worked out in negotiations rather than war. However, what it never really figured out was what would happen if someone did resort to aggressive military action. Who would be expected to intervene militarily? The two biggest examples occurred in 1931 and 1934. In 1931, Japanese troops provoked a border clash with China in Manchuria, without even informing their own government on the Japanese islands. The Japanese leadership then used this clash to begin a war with China that helped them gain control of Manchuria and brought condemnation from the League of Nations. However, Japan just simply rejected the League's findings and withdrew. The League was powerless to stop them, since Great Britain was the only nation in the League able to possibly fight in the Far East, and they had no desire to fight a war with Japan and risk their Asian possessions, while at the same time leaving them weak in the Mediterranean, which the rising Italian naval power could use to strike at Gibraltar and the Suez. That takes us to 1934, with the beginning of the Abyssinian crisis. Mussolini was the dictator in charge of Italy, and he dreamed of recreating the Roman Empire in the Mediterranean. Italy already had possessions in Africa, like Libya, Eritrea, and Italian Somaliland. The last two share a border with Abyssinia, or modern-day Ethiopia. Mussolini wants to take over Abyssinia to link these two and exert more key strategic influence near the Suez Canal. So, in 1935, Italy begins their invasion, and the leader of Abyssinia appeals to the League of Nations for help. Here is an exact test case of why the League of Nations was created. A larger nation aggressively attacking a smaller one. However, powers like France and Great Britain are hesitant to intervene. For one thing, both of these powers see Italy as a useful ally in case of future German aggression, and are afraid if they come across too harshly in Abyssinian defense, Italy may then go over to unite with Germany. As well, Italy has a large and powerful navy in the Mediterranean. Great Britain is worried a war with Italy would lead to loss of possessions in the Mediterranean, or that Japan could use that as an excuse to attack British Far East possessions, at a time when they are distracted with Italy. This crisis comes at an especially bad time since both Britain and France are trying to establish a naval treaty with Italy. And finally, and most underrated, public support to go to war over Abyssinia is non-existent. So the League issues sanctions, but makes sure they won't be too harsh as to enrage Italy. What this means is that, for example, the import of foie gras was banned, but not coal, or iron, or steel, or most importantly, oil, since Italy was heavily dependent on the import of oil. As the war continues, the British government starts to consider an oil embargo, but Mussolini becomes enraged, claiming that that would constitute a declaration of war. Fear of war crushes any thought of an oil embargo. Eventually, it even gets out that the British and French statesmen were working to push the Abyssinian leaders to accept Italian control over most of their territory, effectively rewarding Italy for aggression, which causes even more political turmoil in both countries. In the end, Abyssinia fell by early 1936, and with it, the League of Nations lost all respect as a body capable of stopping aggressive regimes. By the time of the Spanish Civil War in 1936, both fascist Italy and Germany were actively engaging in support of the Spanish nationalists, while Spanish communist forces were being aided by Soviet Russia, and the League of Nations just stood idly by and watched as a proxy war to test new military technology was waged, showing how truly powerless the League was. In Germany, Hitler watched these events very closely, as two aggressive moves by Italy and Japan had forced France and Britain to back away. From this, he surmised that the Western democracies had no stomach for a fight, and would give in when strongly confronted. Now was the time to act. So now it's Hitler's turn to test the Western democracies. His first small test comes in 1935, when he unveiled the existence of the German Air Force, which was forbidden in Versailles, and reintroduced conscription, expanding the size of the German army over 100,000, which was also banned by Versailles. As well, he concluded a naval treaty with Britain during the Abyssinian crisis, which allowed Germany to start building submarines. After those moves, Nazi Germany started to make some territorial moves, the first two of which were just simply reaffirming what most considered already theirs. Starting with in 1936 the Saarland voting to return to German control. Then it was time to return the Rhineland back to Germany. Under the Locarno Pact, this key area was to stay demilitarized, something France saw as very important, since an undefended Rhineland could be used as an invasion route into Germany, a pretty strong deterrent for any aggressive German foreign policy. Also, because of Locarno, if any nation broke the pact, all the other nations were obligated to intervene. France was in political turmoil after the Abyssinian crisis and remembered world reaction to the last time they marched into Germany all the way back in 1923. So, decided against any action unless they were backed up by Italy or Britain. Britain had no desire to start a war over Germany simply taking back what was rightfully hers. Plus, the full return of the Rhineland was inevitably going to happen, so why fight on the issue and alienate Germany? So Hitler's first gamble had paid off. The Rhineland was militarized. Next up was Austria. This is a big step because Austria was its own sovereign nation rather than simply bringing in a historically German area back under German control. Hitler's stated goal at this point was to bring all the German-speaking people under German rule, so the question of sovereignty was irrelevant. By this time, it's now early 1938, and Great Britain has a new Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, the man who made appeasement famous. He did not invent appeasement, though. It was the reluctant policy of most British governments since the early 1920s. Feeling guilty over the terms of Versailles and the country's general lack of interest in getting involved in European continental affairs, most British governments leaned towards compromise with Germany. However, Chamberlain solidified appeasement into an active policy. So rather than some reactionary, half-hearted decision, he believed appeasement and negotiation with Hitler's Germany was a path towards world peace. He just needs to find out what Germany actually wants. Then he can tie them down into an agreement that will avoid a future conflict. Chamberlain was looking to make colonial concessions in Africa to Germany in order for them to accept the status quo of the Eastern European borders. However, Hitler is determined to enact Anschluss, or the annexation of Austria. First, he demanded the Austrian Nazis should be installed into key government posts, which the Austrian Chancellor rejected. Then, he had the leader of the Austrian Nazi Party declare himself head of a provisional government and request immediate assistance from Germany. Hitler mobilized his forces and the Austrian Chancellor requested advice from Britain. The British government realized they were in no position to go to war over Austria and told him there was nothing they could do to help him. With that, Germany marched into Austria to receive a grand reception, which seemed to confirm to Western leaders that even though this was aggressive diplomacy, at the end of the day, Austria wanted to be part of Germany, and it made sense not to intervene. The country most overlooked in this Austrian situation was Italy. Italy was supposed to be the protectorate over Austria, but during the German takeover of Austria, they already had their hands full with Abyssinian and Spanish conflicts. Skillfully though, Mussolini used the Anschluss to convince the British Prime Minister Chamberlain that he was livid at German actions and looking to help stand against it. However, he needed to know the British were no longer holding animosity towards Italy from the already mentioned Abyssinian and Spanish conflicts. If Great Britain could conclude a deal with Italy accepting Italian rule in Abyssinia, Italy could promise to pull out of Spain. Secretly though, Mussolini had already concluded a deal with Hitler that allowed Germany to take control of Austria in return for certain pledges regarding Italian interest in Spain. As Italy and Germany continued to grow closer at the expense of the democracies, support for appeasement was taking a hit. The Italian-English dealings during this time directly led to Anthony Eden's resignation as Foreign Secretary of Great Britain. He was really the only anti-appeasement voice in Chamberlain's cabinet at that time. Winston Churchill is the most famous anti-appeasement voice, but at this point his voice didn't carry a lot of weight. He was still remembered as the man who failed at Gallipoli. Without him, appeasement was the go-to strategy for the next crisis. Now comes Czechoslovakia, which, even though is never part of modern Germany, it has a very sizable German minority in the Sudetenland. Hitler claimed these German minorities were mistreated at the hands of the ruling Czechs and needed to be united under German rule. The main interest for Hitler, though, was strategic. Czechoslovakia is positioned to do critical damage to Germany in the event of war, poking right into his vulnerable side. Along with Poland in the east, France envisioned these two countries as the key to collective security against any German aggression. France and Russia had even entered into a defensive agreement to protect Czechoslovakia in case she was attacked. The key provision was that France had to first come to Czechoslovakia's aid, then Russia would join in. Czechoslovakia wasn't exactly a pushover either. They had a sizable military with strong defensive fortifications along their border with Germany. While German tanks had issues breaking down on their victory march through Austria, they were not quite the military machine that they would become later. As well, if France and Britain got involved in an offensive against Germany's western border, they could do some real damage. Since Germany only had a small number of divisions available there, and the Siegfried Line was a mere construction site at that point. Although any aggressive response to a German move on Czechoslovakia was not a certainty. For France, their economic issues combined with the heavy investment into defensive fortifications, like those along the Maginot Line, made any alone offensive into Germany highly unlikely. And without a common border with Czechoslovakia, they can't exactly help fend off the German invasion there. For the British, they see three options. 1. Form a grand alliance of several states into a defensive bloc. Number 2, make a new commitment to France to come to her aid if she's attacked by Germany after coming to Czechoslovakia's aid. And number 3, give no new commitments and advise Czechoslovakia to come to the best possible terms with Germany. The first was ruled out because British leaders do not want any further obligations for the British Empire, which might lead to the loss of everything. Also around this time was when Soviet Russia was going through Stalin's purges, and British leaders doubted their ability to be helpful in a war, so they were marked off as an alliance possibility. The second was squashed because the point was raised that there was no way that Great Britain could practically help Czechoslovakia in a war. With the fall of Austria, Germany now had a way around Czechoslovakia's strongest defenses, and the lack of access to Czechoslovakia's borders, combined with the country's lack of access to the sea, there was no way of actually aiding them. Instead, it was likely that Czechoslovakia would fall quickly and Great Britain would be at war with Germany whenever their own rearmament program was far behind that of Germany's. Couple that with a public mood that was disinterested to get involved in a war for a country most had no idea where it even was, and you have a British government moving towards appeasement and starting a domino effect that would end Czechoslovakia. By September of 1938, tensions were rising, and Germany was mobilizing their forces and sending out strong signals that if their grievances were not addressed by the end of September, war would follow. Neville Chamberlain then made the bold move to appeal to Hitler directly and offered to come to Germany to negotiate. Hitler accepted, and away Chamberlain went. France and Czechoslovakia weren't exactly thrilled by this unilateral action on their behalf. Before these talks, it's important to know that Chamberlain had already mentally accepted the idea of the Sudeten Germans being given self-determination and returning to Germany. So, when Hitler claimed that this was his last territorial demand, then he would be satisfied, Chamberlain jumped at it. Here was the settlement to make Germany happy and end the possibility of war. Now he just needed to convince the Czechs to accept it. It was a win-win for Hitler. If Chamberlain succeeded, he got what he wanted, and if he failed, he would get his war. The French, for their part, at first resisted the idea of bowing to Hitler, but that didn't last very long and they gave in, agreeing to help pressure the Czech government to accept a vote by the Sudeten residents, which would then lead to Germany taking over the territory. Reluctantly, Czechoslovakia realized without French or British support, they were doomed and conceded. Hitler then added more drama by threatening war if the Sudetenland wasn't immediately given to him instead of waiting for a vote. That is what led to the Conference of Munich on September 30th, 1938. However, the key decision of sacrificing Czechoslovakia had already been made, so that conference, which the Czech leaders weren't even allowed to attend, was just speeding up the timeline of what had already been decided. Italy and Germany had formed a united front throughout the Munich agreements that would eventually lead to the Pact of Steel agreement in May of 1939, where Hitler and Mussolini solidified a secret military alliance. The annexation of Czechoslovakia by Germany shored up a key vulnerable point on Germany's eastern border, and provided plenty of material. In the Sudetenland, they acquired 1.5 million rifles, 750 aircraft, 600 tanks, and 2,000 field guns, along with raw materials like timber. As well, the surrender of Czechoslovakia saw the evaporation of a possible alliance with Russia. After seeing the Western democracies cave under fascist pressure once again, Stalin brought in a new foreign minister, in Molotov, and moved away from trusting collective security and towards an agreement with Nazi Germany. Their plan was to create as big of a buffer zone as possible between Russia proper and Nazi Germany. The reception in Britain to this settlement is well documented, as Neville Chamberlain claimed proudly to have secured peace with honor and peace in our time. However, that enthusiasm for peace in our time got a serious hit when Hitler didn't take long to violate the Munich Agreement, when in March of 1939 he took over the rest of Czechoslovakia. As well, Italy felt emboldened enough to invade and conquer Albania in April of 1939. From there, France and Britain made the determination that the next territorial move by Germany would mean war. That move would be Poland. In the summer of 1939, Nazi Germany issued threats to Poland over the Polish corridor and their control over the port city of Danzig. Poland refused to budge, while the British and French stated that any attack on Poland would mean war. However, now the idea of collective security to combat Germany was gone. Both Austria and Czechoslovakia had been absorbed in the east, leaving Germany able to concentrate all of its military might on Poland. And it's not like Russia will come to protect Poland either, since Poland distrusts, and not unreasonably I might add, that if any Russian troops enter Polish territory to help, that they would ever leave. As if to confirm that, Molotov and Ribbentrop for Russia and Germany concluded an agreement which divided Poland between the two, and let Russia have a free hand with the Baltic states while Germany was free to move in Western Europe. With that agreement, Germany is free to make her move on Poland, knowing France doesn't have the offensive capacity to strike at Western Germany. And Great Britain, while powerful at sea, can do no critical damage to German forces on land. Hitler did have momentary second thoughts when Mussolini stated that Italy would remain neutral in any conflict over Poland, but that didn't exactly last long and Hitler regained his determination to finally execute his long-awaited struggle. So, on September 1st, Nazi Germany begins their invasion of Poland, and for the next 6 years, the world would be at war. That is a timeline of appeasement in relation to World War II. Obviously, there are a lot of things that weren't covered in this video that had a big impact on the Second World War starting, like the rise of Imperial Japan or Soviet Russia. However, for this video, it is purely meant to give the viewer an in-depth look at the timeline of appeasement. If you'd like to learn more, I recommend reading Tim Bouverie's book called Appeasement. I'll leave a link in the description. I hope you learned something new. If you didn't, congrats on being a fucking genius.